There are a lot of things I miss about childhood. My back not hurting, summer breaks, and not having to pay taxes. When I was a kid, it was also easy to tell the good guys from the bad guys because the bad guys all existed in Saturday morning cartoons and comic books. And you could tell which people were good and which were bad just by the way the cartoonists and animators drew them. And then I grew up and I learned the horrific truth that the worst of the bad guys are so dangerous because they disguise themselves as good guys. They do just enough good to convince people that they are good guys, to coax down those walls of skepticism and cajole the unsuspecting and vulnerable into revealing those soft white underbellies. And is there anyone more vulnerable than a parent grieving the tragic loss of their child? The police were supposed to investigate the fire, give the family answers as to what happened, and if necessary, prosecute those responsible. And I have no doubt that there were cops that were intent on accomplishing this mission. But like a fart in church, a single corrupt cop or investigator, just one wolf in a constable's uniform can decimate the integrity of an entire organization. And when they have help from higher up the chain of command, like a metastasized cancer of corruption eating the organization from the inside out, it is those vulnerable people, just like the families of the ghost train victims, that are deprived of truth, justice, and ultimately, peace. It's been more than 40 years since the ghost train fire. More than 40 years of alleged lies and corruption that cost these families closure. Join us as we find out exactly what it was that cost these families their loved ones and justice. This is Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark city landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer and former firefighter.
And I'm just your average time traveler, although I do have the gift of being able to look into the multiverse and discern potential outcomes for practically every situation I've ever been in. I'm really just here because these stories are relevant on at least 3 different timelines. But don't worry, after the podcast wars of 2042, we're all going to be much better friends.
Good to know. Good to know. Please be sure to follow us on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. When you see content from us, it is especially helpful if you interact with that content. Like it, share it with your circle, DM it to a friend, leave a comment. Those are the things that help the algorithm push our content to new people so we can grow our audience. Also, don't forget to tell your friends, and of course, check out the link in our show notes for our spread shop, where you can find sweet, sweet merch so you can make your bodies our walking billboard. We will love you forever.
I promise I will.
You can email us your fire stories, case suggestions, and feedback at crimetoburn@gmail.com. And if you are listening but haven't yet left us a 5-star review on the listening platform of your choice, please consider going to do that. It is so incredibly helpful, and it's one of the easiest ways that you can show your support for any podcast that you enjoy. Thanks to those of you that have sent emails this week. One of you in particular sent a very sweet email that came on a day when I was having a really frustrating day, and it was delightful to receive. And if you listen on Podbean, Spotify, or Good Pods, you can leave individual episode comments, and those are also really helpful also. A few reminders of other places that you can hear us. Several weeks ago, we were talking about Centralia with Sasquatch and Sourdough, so you can go check that out. Coming up later this month, we're going to be on an episode of Ruddle Me This with Taylor Ruddle, and I will let you know the exact date that that's going to drop as soon as I know it. And finally, last night we recorded with From Dirt We Grow, and when that's available, I will let you know also. Okay, so last week we discussed the horrific fire that happened at Luna Park in Sydney, Australia in the Ghost Train ride. The Ghost Train was an amusement park ride that was like a haunted house, except instead of walking through it, you rode a little train car. There was a fire inside the ride, and at the time it's estimated that there were somewhere around 30 people inside the ride when the fire occurred, and 7 people didn't escape. 4 of them were 8th graders at Waverly College that had been enjoying their first night out at the park without their parents. Along with them, Jenny Godson's husband John and their 2 boys also died. We also talked about how one of the ride-goers smelled kerosene when the initial flames appeared to break out in the little fire vignette inside the ride.
It's nice the way you frame that, like a little fire vignette. You go into it, it's got soft edges. It's all terribly fiery and doom, but like the edges are soft. You want to remember it just like that.
In addition, when the ride operators went into the building to try to help evacuate the people inside, one of the ride operators indicated that he also smelled kerosene. Then we discussed that at 3 p.m., the day after the fire, so less than 24 hours after the fire, police investigator Douglas Knight held a press conference in which he announced that the fire was an accidental fire caused by an electrical fault within the building. Now, in case I wasn't abundantly clear, I do not believe for 1 second that they could have known at that point what the cause of the fire was. They would have had so much evidence to sift through to determine a cause of the fire that it's impossible to have conducted that level of investigation in less than 24 hours. But by this point, they already had cranes in there and workers clearing the scene of all the ruins of the ride, destroying any evidence that might have existed along with it. Then there was the local boy named Les Dowd that was living in a youth refuge, and he told police that he'd overheard someone talking about setting the fire intentionally. He had gone to the police to give his statement, but had been later recalled to the police station by different officers, and while there he was separated from his guardian, the woman that ran the youth refuge, and something had happened to cause him to then recant his entire statement. But before we get back to Les Dowd and Inspector Knight, let's talk about what made this fire so deadly. Now obviously, I am very familiar with fire and building codes in the USA, but not so much the fire and building codes in Australia. And while it does appear that there were building and fire codes in effect in 1979 in Australia, I don't know if they had any provisions specifically for special amusement buildings like the ghost train ride. I can tell you that in the USA, special amusement buildings were added to NFPA 101, the Life Safety Code, in the 1980s after a similar fire occurred here in the United States. And now there are requirements for special amusement buildings in both the USA and Australia, and because of my day job, I have access to all of those requirements for the USA, but not so much for Australia. So as we discussed, the ghost train was painted all black inside, and the ride operators reported that even when the lights were on, it was so dark in there, people often ran into doors and walls anyway. So once you add thick black smoke to an all-black building interior, one of the contributing factors that prevented the 7 victims of this fire from finding the fire exit was definitely a lack of visibility. Today we have to have emergency lights in these kinds of rides, and in the United States, these lights have to be interconnected with the fire alarm system so that if and when the fire alarm goes off, the lights automatically come on. And speaking of fire alarms, there was not a fire alarm system in the building, nor were there any fire sprinklers. In fact, the year before the fire, fire inspectors had recommended the addition of sprinklers to the ghost train ride, citing the wooden tunnel represented an unacceptable fire hazard. Apparently, inspectors found that even with the lights on, the black walls and ceilings coupled with the low light and the maze of passageways made it nearly impossible to navigate through on foot without just following the train track. As a result, they'd strongly recommended a fire sprinkler system be installed just the year before. However, owners had not implemented the recommendation because of the cost. In fact, because they hadn't done anything toward improving the safety by adding a sprinkler system or taking any of the other recommendations, the fire department had finally given the building owners a deadline to comply with the recommendations and install a sprinkler system just 4 weeks before the fire. They'd have a year to implement the requirement. However, such a time limit was unnecessary because the ride burned to the ground in the meantime. Had they given them a time limit when they called for the ride to be sprinkler protected the year before, we might not be sitting here having this conversation. Another issue was marking of means of egress. Here in the United States, current codes require not only that we have emergency exit signs, but that specifically in these kinds of special amusement buildings that we have photoluminescent markings to lead people toward exits. Now, I couldn't find anywhere that discussed whether the ghost train had signs for the emergency exits or not. However, based on the ride operator's description that he had opened the emergency exit and began leading people to it, it seems like it wasn't very well identified. And even if it was, the fact that the ride was designed to be divided up into multiple compartments with swinging doors, and that the train went around sharp turns to disorient riders going back and forth, it made it even harder for riders to have a sense of their location to help them in finding the emergency exit. In amusement buildings like this, it's not uncommon for ride designers or operators to want to disguise exit doors because they don't really fit into the theme of a haunted house. However, according to current fire and building codes in the United States, it's not just illegal to block exit doors, but it's required that you can't obscure them. This means you can't, put a mirror on them that would confuse people in an emergency. You can't hide them behind a bookcase or a wall panel or behind curtains. They have to be... Or a dragon. They have to be readily accessible and identifiable. And one of the biggest contributing factors to this fire was the interior finish. To the best of my knowledge, it appears that the decorations inside the ghost train were mostly things like paper mache and fabric, and some areas had streamers. And today, when we design these buildings, we prescribe what kinds of interior finish can be included, and they're required to meet flame spread ratings and smoke development ratios. Also, of important note, if you're someone that builds temporary haunted houses around the Halloween holidays and they're open to the public, these requirements also apply to temporary haunted houses. If you don't know the requirements, it would not protect you from civil or criminal liability if something awful happened. These facilities, including these homemade or DIY haunted houses, still have to meet fire and building codes for special amusement buildings, so don't take the risk if you're not aware of the requirements. And yes, even small temporary haunted houses can be required to have sprinklers depending on how big they are.
And I want to get up on a soapbox for a minute.
Go ahead.
Because I spent a lot of time in the foam industry making all kinds of things out of it, movie props. And please encapsulate your foam. Please coat it in something responsible. Use a fiberglass mesh. Use a cementous base coat. Use an epoxy resin. Use something to encapsulate the foam so that the fire can just evaporate it and cause horrible melting nightmares on your guests.
So basically it turns into napalm when it's unencapsulated.
It's pretty awful, and it just burns the whole time, and it doesn't burn out as fast as you think it might for its physical embodiment. It burns on a bit longer, pools, and becomes nasty shit, man. But I love foam, and I want more people to carve things out of foam and to make wonderful things for other people to look at and express yourself. But man, encapsulate it, and don't be lazy. Don't leave pockets. Don't leave little corners. Do your job.
I second that. So last week we also talked about Les Dowd. He was the boy living in a youth refuge that went to police to tell them what he had seen and heard that night. What he told police was that he was at Luna Park and he saw 5 blokes, his word.
I like that word.
Standing together facing the magic shop. One of them he estimated was about 18 years old, about 5 foot 10 inches with blonde straight shoulder length hair, a skinny build, a fair complexion. He was wearing brown boots that came up to his knees with jeans tucked into them. He was also wearing a jacket with dark sleeves, and he specifically remembers that there was a split in the sleeves for the cuff, and the split went all the way to the elbow. Les noted that this guy had his left ear pierced, and in it was a small ring with a gold cross hanging from it, and his right ear had a light blue star tattoo on the earlobe. When Les saw him, he was looking directly at the ghost train. The boys with him looked a little younger, perhaps 16 or 17. All of them had earrings in their left ears, and one of them had on a navy blue jumper, which is what we would call a sweater in the United States. And he recalled that the lower...
A jumper is a sweater?
Mm-hmm. Well, here in the United States, if you say jumper, most people are going to think you're talking about a type of dress. That's like an overall type dress. Jumper is a sweater in the UK and in Australia. And probably other places.
Fantastic. You know what? I'm not saying I wouldn't wear a jumper.
Les recalled that the lower part of the sleeves of this jumper were ripped up. Now, Les was about 2 feet away from the group, he says, when he heard one of them say, "I spread the kerosene and lit it with a match." And another one responded to him, saying that he was a fool for doing it, and then the boys started running toward the exit. So Michael, and again, I'm not sure I'm saying this guy's last name correctly, Maher? Yeah, he was the constable that we discussed last week, the one that took Les's statement. He completely believed Les was telling the truth, and so he immediately, after formalizing Les's statement and having him sign it, put out an alert to be on the lookout for the people matching this description. And Les's recollection was extremely detailed, and when he was asked how he could remember such detail, he explained he was a homeless kid living in refuges, and he had become a very observant person as a survival mechanism. He noticed everything about everyone because failure to accurately interpret a situation could have detrimental effects on his own safety and security, and that makes total sense to me.
Hell yeah, it does.
When the constable finished collecting Les's statement, he put out that alert and he went home because it was the end of his shift. And Les, along with Julie, the woman that ran the youth refuge, returned to the refuge eager to get some sleep. But not long after they got home, police showed up, different police officers this time. At this point, Constable Maher would have been home heading to bed, presumably, and Les and Julie didn't know why the police wanted them back to the station so soon after they just left, but they did return to the station. At the station, Julie recalls that they separated Les from her for a bit, and this made her feel upset. She didn't know what they were doing taking him away, and she was only 22 years old, and she didn't know if it was appropriate or not, and she didn't know what she might do about it. But when they finally led Les back into the interview room where Julie was, Les's entire body language had changed. When police asked him, he told them that everything he'd said earlier in that first interview was completely false. He'd made all of it up. Les fully recanted his first statement, and police typed it up and handed it to him to sign, and he did. And Julie was horrified. She knew that something had happened to cause Les to change his story, and she knew that the initial story he told police had to have been the truth, and the second recantation was 100% false.
Welcome to the shakedown, baby.
Then, police charged Les Dowd with making a false report and being a public nuisance, and he ended up getting 12 months of probation and a $100 fine.
Damn.
But Les hadn't voluntarily changed his statement. He reports that the cop that pulled him aside and separated him from Julie was bigger and very assertive, and he scared Les. He told Les that if he didn't recant, something bad would happen to him and that they would get him. Now, Les said he didn't know exactly what they meant, but they seemed to imply that if he didn't recant, they would pin the blame for the fire directly on him. Now, Les Dowd was terrified. He was a homeless kid. He had no way to fight false allegations against him, so he did what police told him to do. He recanted his story. And the alert issued for the boys that Les initially said he observed discussing starting the fire with kerosene was canceled.
Those lazy motherfuckers, man.
Les obviously had a hard life as a homeless child, and so with his recantation, police just dismissed him. And Les was scared to ever bring it back up again to anybody. But what if I told you that another person went to police with a similar story?
I would be shocked and aghast.
That person is Tina Shakeshaft. She was with Les when he overheard the conversation between the bikies, as they call them apparently in Australia.
Bikies?
The bikies. It doesn't sound as tough as bikers. It honestly sounds kind of adorable to me.
Bikies.
The little bikies.
Like you had bike done to you.
I feel like if you went into a biker bar here and you tried to call one of them a bikie...
But those are bikers, not bikies. There's I think, a significant difference.
No, they meant motorcycle bikers. Bikies.
Really?
Yeah.
Did they have little hats?
And they didn't say anything about hats.
Oh, I bet they did.
But I feel like if you went into a biker bar here and you called one of them a bikie, it probably wouldn't be taken well.
Not on the ones I've been to.
No. Now, she had also gone to police, and Constable Michael Maher had also taken her statement. And she told him that she was standing outside with Les when she saw the same boys. And she said that she remembers seeing smoke from the fire starting to come from the ghost train. And that's when Les Dowd told her that one of the guys standing near them said he had started it with matches and kerosene. And so she looked towards the guys he was referring to, and hears one of them say, "You shouldn't have done that." And another one say, "Let's split," or something along those lines, and then they ran out of the park. So even though she didn't hear the kerosene part, she heard the same thing that Les said at the end of his statement. So she was corroborating his statement that these guys really were there and that they were hightailing it out of the park after something happened.
What did they say? Crikey?
I don't think they said crikey. They said, "Let's split."
Oh.
So this corroborates Les's story. Now, she was at the police station, and she was being questioned over and over and over and being drilled by the cop questioning her, and he kept saying things like, "Are you sure Les said that?" And she confirmed that yes, he did, and she felt like he was trying to pressure her into changing her story, and she says that she felt very intimidated.
Are you sure God said don't eat that fruit?
But she refused to change her story. But because Les was supposedly the only one that corroborated her story and he'd recanted his statement, she was basically just classified as a liar and completely dismissed. But then there is Albert Bessel. He was one of the ride operators, and at this point, he has passed away. But he did make statements, and there are written records of his statements. What I can't determine from the coverage in the documentary is if these were written statements given to Martin Sharp in his investigation, or if these came from police records. But on the same morning that Tina and Les were interviewed, here's what Albert says he saw. About 10 minutes before the fire was noticed, I saw about 9 men and 2 or 3 girls who I would describe as bikers going to the ride. Or I think you said bikies, but my computer auto-corrected to bikers. One was 5'10", solid build, brown full beard about a foot long. His beard was scraggly.
His beard was a foot long?
His beard was a foot long.
I like it.
He was in a car with another man that had a pointed black beard. He said he was worried about the bikers or the bikies going into the ride because normally there would be a ride operator inside the building monitoring riders to be sure they didn't do anything that they shouldn't, like smoking, but they were short-staffed and so they didn't have anyone inside the ride. And it seems from the interview that he wasn't necessarily worried about them taking kerosene and starting a fire, but that he was more worried about smoking or vandalism.
Like I can see the sign, no smoking, no shanking, no taking over of local communities.
However, they were busy, and so there was no one in the ride, and about 10 minutes after they entered the ride was when he first heard someone yell fire. And that woman that first reported that she'd seen the small flames in the fire vignette that we talked about last week, the one that reached her hand out and felt the heat from it, she told investigators that she had seen bikies departing the train as they were getting on the ride or waiting to get on the ride. And then there was Alan Chappell. He was working at the park, and he made a statement that there were a group of 6 to 8 people that he had confronted that night because one of them had a can of beer which was not permitted at the park.
Is this Australia?
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was mandatory to have a beer everywhere in Australia.
Apparently not at Luna Park.
What?
Not in 1979, I guess.
We've come a long way, baby.
He described them, including one he estimated to be about 20, 5'8" to 5'10", with a slim build, shoulder-length blonde dirty hair, a dirty complexion, wearing a white t-shirt, and a blue vest with jeans.
So he was just generally dirty.
Yeah. He described him as having a large, droopy Spanish mustache and was unshaven. The second man he estimated was about 23 and about the same height with a more stocky build and a pockmarked face. He only remembers that the others with them were younger and that there was a man with a scruffy appearance and blonde hair among them. And one of the ride operators, Frank Boitano, he's actually now a criminal lawyer.
In relation to Brian Boitano?
Not that I know of. He said that he also noticed the bikies down toward the turnstiles at one point and noted that one of them had a long beard, as described by another witness. Remember Jutta that had ridden the train earlier and seen the early stages of the fire where it looked like it was penetrating through the wall? Well, her niece has since passed away, but she was there that night, and her niece reported to Jutta that she had told officers about the bikies that she had seen on the ride before them, but police told her that they weren't going to put it in their official written statement for her to sign because they couldn't prove the bikies were there anyway. And Jutta says she remembers being told the same thing. So Jutta and her niece, ride operators Frank and Albert, park employee Alan, Les and Tina, that's 7 people with similar corroborating stories. And despite all that, very soon after Les left the police station with Julie to return to the youth refuge, the alert that people were to be on the lookout for this crew was canceled. And those that had written statements that included the bikies were called back, and all of them were intimidated into changing their statements and recanting. So why would police ignore the statements of 7 eyewitnesses? Why would they bully people into changing their statements? Why would they declare the fire accidental just hours after the fire and long before they could have ever possibly done a complete investigation? The general consensus was that it was a massive cover-up. But who ordered it? The fact that 7 people's eyewitness statements were essentially doctored and ignored is enough of a red flag, but that's not all. Richard Carroll's mother didn't know any of these people. Richard Carroll was one of the 4 boys that died in the fire. She didn't know a single one of these 7 people. She hadn't talked to them or heard what they had reported to police. Now, in the days after the fire, she was obviously a grief-stricken mother planning her son's funeral. And she remembers one specific thing about the funeral. In the back of the church, there was a group of girls that were absolutely devastated, sobbing and bereft. She remembers them wondering who they were and if maybe they had been the girls intending to meet the boys that night at the park. But then much later, and she's not clear in her interview how much later, but it sort of implies that maybe it was months, possibly even a year or more later, she gets a phone call one night from one of those girls. And the girl was very upset and told Mrs. Carroll that she and her friends had been the girls that were supposed to meet the boys that night at the park, but they didn't go. And the reason they didn't go was her father had forbidden it, telling them that something was going down that night at Luna Park and they had to stay home. Her father was a man named Jack Rooklyn. He was a poker machine operator connected to the Genovese crime family.
Look, dude, that is perfect. How is your name Jack Rooklyn and you're involved with poker and a crime family? That is beautiful.
Now, Jack Rooklyn had been in legal trouble 5 years before the fire. He was accused of being involved in organized crime, but he'd been cleared by none other than Inspector Douglas Knight.
And now there's a Knight. We got the whole chessboard happening.
Well, Douglas Knight was the investigator that gave that interview that I showed you the clip of last week.
Oh, that guy's not checkmating anything.
The same man that got on TV less than 24 hours after the fire and told everyone he was confident it was an electrical fire. And it made front page news in 1974 when Inspector Knight was accused of having accepted a job from Jack Rooklyn. And it was investigated by the Royal Commission into Organized Crime.
Oh, my.
Apparently that investigation didn't go anywhere because he was still an investigator in 1979 when the fire occurred. And he would be accused again in 1981 of accepting bribes from Rooklyn. But Inspector Knight's resume is so much more than just being a puppet for a crime lord. His troubled history starts way back in 1954 when he allegedly coerced a suspect into signing a confession. And then he went on to assault suspects during questioning, and he was given the dubious title by all of those who knew him as a quid man, which would be a man who would fix your legal troubles for money.
He sounds like a really nice guy.
In a written report authored by Doug Knight, he says that they have 4 individual eyewitnesses that say they saw sparks shortly before the fire in the area of an arch in the vicinity of the roof, and that's how they came to the conclusion that it was an electrical fire. None of these 4 witnesses can be found. And none of the people that have been interviewed that were on the ghost train when the fire broke out or immediately before recall seeing any sparks anywhere, and certainly nothing along the roof of the building. There are 24 witness statements for which there are written records, and not a single one of those ever indicates anyone admitted to seeing sparks in the ride or at the roof. 24 witness statements, 0 claiming to have seen sparks that could have indicated an electrical fire. But Inspector Knight's report said it was an electrical fire. Sure would like to ask him about that, but he's dead. But in the coroner's inquest into the fire, an electrical engineer showed up and testified that there's no way the ride had an electrical fire. How do we know? Well, the trains continued to operate during the height of the fire. If the fire had originated in one of the 2 electrical boxes in the building, the train would have stopped running. The ride operators reported being repeatedly hit by trains as they were trying to help people get out of the car. It was still operating.
Oh, crap.
In addition, there are photos during the height of the fire, that show every single light in and on the building were still working and were on. All of them. But the most damning piece of evidence is based on photographs of the scene after the fire. Based on the investigator's statement, the electrical box had to have been the cause of the fire. So I'm going to show you a scene from the fire that shows the electrical box in question. I want you to tell me what you see. That's the electrical box in question. The wall's all gone here, everything around it's burned, but what do you notice about that electrical box? What would you expect to see if the fire had started in that electrical box?
Oh, yeah, it doesn't have any charring on it or anything.
Doesn't have any charring on it, and everything around it is destroyed, and the electrical box is basically the only thing that has survived.
Well, actually, not everything even is destroyed. You can see the wires coming off the top of it, which you'd expect to be completely smoked and gone, or still, they look fine.
Exactly. But this is what Inspector Knight said started the fire. This pristine-looking electrical box. Practically the only thing that survived the fire.
You might not be smart.
But no worries, these people that all gave statements about the bikies and the people that saw the flames in the fire vignette early in the fire, they were all called to the coroner's inquest so they'd have a chance to set the record straight. And they did show up, and they sat and waited to do their part to testify. And not a single one of them was ever called to testify, not a single one. However, that electrical engineer did throw a figurative wrench into Doug Knight's fantasy. And he did testify, so after the inquest, they just changed tact and said that it was likely started by a cigarette. So journalists asked each of the eyewitnesses if they'd seen anyone smoking in or on the ride, and no one recalled seeing anyone smoking or smelling cigarette smoke. The only smell anyone recalled were the one rider and the one operator that both reported smelling kerosene. Doug Knight's former colleagues have things to say about him, though. He was known as a fixer, the kind of cop that fixed court cases for the right people. They said he would change evidence, delete evidence, dilute evidence, intimidate witnesses into changing statements. That's his history. That's how he was known in the department. And he certainly did this at Luna Park, because when Mary Carroll went to the scene 2 days after the fire, expecting to see a cordoned-off crime scene with an ongoing investigation, she found nothing but the building foundation with a track inlaid in it, and that was all that remained. Everything else had been completely cleared away, all of the evidence destroyed. Now, the officer above Doug Knight was named Jim Black. He was the assistant commissioner. He was described by other cops as crook as a rook. From a confidential police intelligence file from 2 years after the fire, it was learned that Assistant Commissioner Jim Black was being paid off by Jack Rooklyn. But he wasn't the only one. There were other people on Rooklyn's payroll, including Detective Inspector Douglas Knight. And there was one other person involved in the investigation, which can be confirmed with photographs to be on the scene, and his name was Bill Allen. He was the Deputy Police Commissioner, and he was described by former colleagues as, and I quote, "the most corrupt police officer in any police force in the whole of this world," unquote. And he was found to be involved in setting up a protection racket. He was a thief, he bribed officers, and he did eventually go to prison related to some of these activities, and he was known to be on Jack Rooklyn's payroll also. As for Jack Rooklyn, the father that kept his girls home the night of the fire because something was, quote, going down, unquote, he was well known by police, very well known. Jim Black, the assistant commissioner, was described as the most corrupt cop ever. It was later discovered that Rooklyn knew him well enough to pay for his hotel rooms while they were visiting Las Vegas. And gambling was illegal in Sydney, and Rooklyn was working with police to help them get support for enforcing laws against new poker gaming machines. You know, a total saintly move. Except that his reasons for this were because Rooklyn franchised a more primitive type of gambling machine that looked more like pinball machines. So Rooklyn was paying police not to notice his gambling machines to prevent these pesky poker gaming machines from being able to come in and ruin his lucrative little business there. And this isn't just allegation. In 1992, 14 years after the fire, he was finally found guilty of corrupting public officials.
Tell me they got some better video games in Australia by now.
Oh, I'm sure they do by now. However, once they got him and put him on trial, he had recently had bypass surgery and actually collapsed during the trial, so instead of prison, he just got some hefty fines. Now remember that the land Luna Park was on was a large parcel of land right on the harbor next to the harbor bridge, opposite the Opera House in the Central Business District. It was a very valuable piece of real estate. There were a lot of people that wanted to get their hands on that property. Powerful people. People with deep pockets and shady business practices. And 7 weeks after the fire, the government called for tenders to lease for the site. This was public land, and the government got to decide who got the lease and who got to operate and use the land. And in November, the government had basically decided to give the tender to the Gundy Corporation. And in records that were dug up at the archives, there are statements that their bid was absolutely the best economically, financially, and socially for the city. And it was about to happen, but inexplicably, the day before, the government decided to call for a new tender and allow all new bidders to enter the ring. And a new bidder did enter the ring, Harborside Amusement. And they won. Despite the fact that the men that ran Harborside Amusement, their names were Carl Goldstein and Hal Goldstein, they were brothers, and they had zero experience running amusement parks. Zero. But how does this all tie together? So far, we have some corrupt cops and investigators suppressing the investigation, a lucrative lease agreement that inexplicably gets yanked away from the best bidder and given to some new kids on the block. To prove that this was an arson for financial gain, we have to have some link that ties these guys operating the park back to those cops that threw the investigation. Well, strap in, because we're going on a twisty-turny ride. You see, Carl and Hal Goldstein, the operators of Harborside, had one very important family connection. Their cousin was a man named Abe Saffron. the man infamously known at the time in Sydney as Mr. Sin, because he operated nightclubs and strip joints that were allegedly brothels throughout the area of Sydney known as King's Cross. He was known far and wide to have mafia ties, but it seems that based on descriptions of his actions that he actually was the mafia in Sydney. According to the cops interviewed for this documentary that I referenced so many times, the areas where Saffron ran these institutions was known for crime, fraud, drugs, prostitution, and of course, gangs. Biker gangs, or bikie gangs. And Saffron was the subject of multiple police investigations, yet somehow he was never punished for his alleged crooked deals or outright crimes. The writing on the wall is that he had all of these corrupt cops and politicians in his pockets. Saffron was known to take part in blackmail, extortion, bribery, and of course, arson. But we'll come back to that. Somehow, it took investigators 5 years to find out that the guys that ran Harborside Amusements that had won the tender were not just related to Abe Saffron, they were his cousins.
Nepotism.
But that's not all. The Corporate Affairs Division determined that not only were they family, which, okay, maybe they're distant family and they don't have any business crossover, but the investigation that they conducted documented that they uncovered social relationships and business relationships.
Oh, thank God. I thought you were going to say they all married their sisters.
Maybe, I don't know. Abe Saffron was absolutely involved with Harborside Amusement. In addition, the financial controller for Harborside was a man named Sam Cowper. He was Abe's nephew, and he managed the trust that controlled all of Abe Saffron's money. And he's the financial controller for Harborside. So it seems like Abe certainly has his sinful little fingers all up in the kiddies' pockets at Luna Park. And if that's not compelling enough, Abe had a successful little arcade business in addition to his less savory businesses, and oh yeah, Harborside installed Abe's arcade machines at Luna Park, so all the money flowing into those machines went straight into Abe Saffron's wallet. But we have one organized crime unit under Abe Saffron that wanted the land and apparently basically got it after the fire. And we have the daughter of another organized crime man, Jack Rooklyn, that appeared to know in advance about the fire. But how do we connect them to say that Jack would have had knowledge of a plan of Abe's to destroy Luna Park? Well, for that, we have to go to Rosemary Opitz. She was a former associate of Saffron's. It seems she was a very close associate, but they never come out and say exactly what her relationship to him was. Just that she was part of his inner circle. But in the documentary, they do show photos of her with people that Saffron was said to be close to, and so it does seem that she's telling the truth. And she confirmed that there was a business relationship between Saffron and Rooklyn, and she knows this because Saffron apparently had these infamous Friday night drink gatherings, and all of the higher-ups in the police force and the politicians in Sydney showed up, and she says that she served all these people drinks, including Rooklyn. But even without Rosemary confirming that Rooklyn and Saffron were associates, it just seems well known that the two were partners in crime, no pun intended. But how do we get to a relationship between bad guys and intentional arson of an amusement park? Well, Mr. Saffron has a pretty long string of being possibly involved in setting a metric poop ton of fires in Sydney. All of them arson. All of them started with kerosene. It was said that he was known to use fire to accomplish his real estate goals. In the early 80s, there was a series of fires in King's Cross in the eastern suburbs. Out of 6 of those fires, Abe Saffron had a real estate interest in 5 of them, and it seemed implied in this documentary that they were all arson, and in each one they found tins or drums of kerosene, and all of the fires had a similar MO. In an inquest, they determined that there was enough evidence to take Abe Saffron to trial for 5 of the 6 fires that occurred in King's Cross. But magically and mysteriously, Mr. Saffron never stood trial for these fires. A prosecutor in the case was interviewed, and he said that his investigation was stonewalled and that there was even death threats, and that he himself had never seen a better example of highly organized crime in his life. He stated that on film. And he also said he knew for a fact that Saffron had police and politicians in his pocket, and that he was just too big and too powerful to be touched. Now, Abe Saffron directly disputes that he had anything to do with the Luna Park fire. But it was well known that Saffron had always wanted the Luna Park land, and it's indisputable that his family and his own executor of his own trust were in direct control of Luna Park after the fire. It sure seems like a big coincidence. And it seems like they tried to keep their familial ties between the company that won the lease tender and Abe Saffron quiet. Now remember, this was 1979, so this information would have been harder to dig up than it is today. There was no 23andMe, no Ancestry.com. So to prove familial relations, you probably would have had to be either really close to the family, or you would have had to go on quite an expedition. And at one point, there was a major investigation into the potential of Abe Saffron's involvement in the Luna Park fire. And this was by the New South Wales Licensing Squad. But the investigation report never saw the light of day. The investigator that conducted the investigation concluded that Abe was likely involved and that a new inquiry into the fire should be conducted. This was from the licensing magistrate, and when he sent the report to police after it was finished, nothing happened. A year later, the New South Wales Corporate Affairs Commission apparently must have lost their copy of the report because they released a report indicating that they had zero evidence of Abe Saffron's connection to or ownership of the company that had won the tender for Luna Park, even though it's clearly there in black and white. And if an artist can find it, I find it hard to believe that the police couldn't find it unless they were intentionally blindfolded. So William Clark, who was part of the Corporate Affairs Commission in 1987 when this report was provided, was interviewed, and he apparently took his acting classes at the same place Doug Knight took his.
Alright, we're looking at her.
Alright, so this is William Clark, and he was part of the Corporate Affairs Commission that released that report that said they found no evidence that Abe Saffron had been involved in the corporation that won the tender for Luna Park. So just watch him as he's questioned. Watch his face.
Have you ever spoken publicly about your role in the Abe Saffron investigations and Doge Crane investigations? I'm just going to run you through a series of responses, people who are critical of that CAC report.
Sure.
Okay. It's a whitewash, that New South Wales CAC report, a whitewash. Another described it as pathetic. And another says Saffron certainly had an interest in the park. Are they all wrong?
Well, I don't think that those criticisms are justified. I don't think it's a whitewash. But, yes, I think it was a missed opportunity.
I think you've seen enough.
Dude, he had to physically hold his face up to make those sounds out of his mouth hole. He was like dying. He was like sitting here melting. I'm melting! Someone threw the water of truth on me and now I'm part of the floor! He's very punchable though. Look at him. Like,
yeah.
That's like a target. Like a fist target.
So let's summarize. We have the girl, daughter of Jack Rooklyn, that said her dad prevented her and her friends from going to the park, saying that something was going down that night. That man, Jack Rooklyn, was known to have investigator Douglas Knight, Jim Black, the assistant commissioner, and Bill Allen, the deputy commissioner, in his pocket. According to Miss Rosemary Oritz and others, there absolutely was a connection between Saffron and Rooklyn, a nefarious business connection. Not to mention, there was a connection between Bill Allen and Saffron directly because, according to Rosemary, Saffron hosted Friday night drink nights to entertain his, quote, associates, unquote, and Bill Allen was frequently there and she served him drinks. And while that connection is tenuous, being reported by a single person to this point, in the documentary there is a second person backing up her story, claiming that he had seen Bill Allen and Saffron dining together on at least one occasion. Saffron wanted the land that Luna Park was on. Saffron is connected to possibly 6 other fires that he used to get his hands on real estate he wanted, all of them arson, all of them started with kerosene. Doug Knight, Bill Allen, and Jim Black were all seen on the scene of the fire, taking part in the investigation. Doug was known as a fixer, Jim was known to be corrupt, and Allen, eventually outed for being one of the most corrupt cops ever, actually ended up going to prison later. And after the fire, the company that won the tender was directly tied to Saffron. That sure seems like a lot of coincidence. And the shady coincidences don't end there, and we'll cover the rest when we wrap up this case next week on Crime to Burn.
And I'm a pouty rock star mode. I don't know what Apple's doing.
You must be disturbed.
There was a button. I was using it. I've been trying to ease myself into retirement. I just picked up my stuff and hiked up my skirt and ran in the house. I didn't even want that invading my body, even though I felt like I got ahead of it, but like I could still taste it. It's gritty, like cream of wheat, but not creamy. It's just the wheat.
And the kid looked at it and goes, "Ooh, is that pee?" Because there's pollen offloading on the top of it. Because it was,
Oh.
and I was like, "No, I hope not." And then I had to break it to her that it was actually tree.
Just like that.
No, I didn't tell her that. I just said it was pollen.
What are you doing to the youth? Just a walking mental scar. I'll be your little canary in your existential coal mine here. I feel like I just lost 50 IQ points. The f*** are you even talking about?
Yeah, so he says, I used to be a big fan, but now I'm a whole air conditioner. And isn't
That
enough
was
for you.
oddly specific. Am I being Truman Showed here? What's happening? Are you doing some fucking product placement where it's hard to stop a train, or it's unlikely that you'll stop a train?
Tell me what
or
else is hard.
Trigonometry.
Trigonometry's delightful.
The kind of sick person are you?
I love trigonometry.
You know what? I don't think I'm being fair to trigonometry. I was never actually invited to trigonometry class. Well, I like triangles. Cost money. Do not spit. Do not spit. Do not spit. Because I want to make friends with this virus and like hang out with it and be like, hey, you may be life-threatening, but at least I don't have to poop all the time.
That's going to be great in the outtakes.
Bodily fluid emission.
Herpes.
Still wouldn't recommend to a friend.
No, it wouldn't.
Like a case of gonorrhea in a 1st Battalion.
Gonorrhea.
Don't write that. Redact.
I went to a Wu-Tang concert and it was...
What?
Yeah.
You lie.
I went to a Wu-Tang concert on the ambulance. I was on duty. I didn't get to stay very long because it didn't take very long for a crowd surfer to have a neck injury.
As a former crowd surfer, there are risks that you just understand. Someone might step on your neck.
Yeah.
And you go forward and you surf that crowd. And you catch those guitar picks. And you elbow those poor fools in the head that are trying to keep you hoisted aloft above the floor, preferably. Aloft is where you want to be as a crowd surfer. That's the curl.
That was
That's
her goal.
the sweet spot in the crowd surfing aloft. Like
Pink eye?
Pink Eye at a Fish concert. Oh, I thought maybe you didn't want to get tased. Well, I'm starstruck today. Come on over and we'll definitely not break your ankles and make you stay in the basement.
We don't do that.
Anymore.
But
I think the good
in
Lord
church.
made farts.
Oh, dear.
There it lingers.
The sentence makes no sense.
Oh, we are our farts in the wind.
Because you wouldn't fart from the outside in.
You'd be hoovering. Are you telling me I've been to college?
Your digestive tract is celebrating.
It's like, whoa, what? I might be educated.
Spicy.
That's not how they smelled. You could have like a regular ass ham sandwich. Don't post any of that.
Okay.
Whoa! Hey, hold up. Stand by for swallowing. And you're not using the right accent either.
Crikey, I said.
Do they say no with one syllable or 4?
Stop wheezing the juice.
I'm imagining you in a turban.
Go back and... Nah. Who wrote this sentence? Fire the
I
writers.
don't know. How do you go back and... is that a verb or a noun?
That person is Tina Shakeshaft.
Why? Who names these people? All right. The way I understand names is that you get them from doing something.
Like the stick on an immersion blender.
But are you shaking the shaft, or is the shaft shaking you?
I've never used an immersion blender like that.
Yet. Whenever you say bikies, I think of like something you catch in that Pokemon game.
I haven't seen his arms up close, I guess.
Yes, you have. But you didn't look at him like I did.
Early stages where it penetrated through the wall and looked like fists of fire coming through the wall.
Why did you write penetrated right behind fists?
Inspector Douglas Knight.
Dun, 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 Inspector Douglas. My body has an aversion to its ass falling asleep. I felt it touch me. I probably hallucinated the whole thing. This episode's been brought to you by dissociative hallucinations. Have you one?
Sorry to put your butt to sleep again. We have the rest of the day to fart around.
Feels icky. It sounds like a disease. I'm not sure I want it. What if I have to pay a doctor to get rid of it? I am a high maintenance bitch. I don't know if I could justify my existence. No, I still don't understand trapezoids. What the f*** were we talking about that?
I'll draw it on the whiteboard later.
My brain doesn't math. And that's called resonance.
No.
And that's called testicular resonance.
No.
And that's called resonance.
No. All right, I think it's time to just pull the plug here.
The plug.
No, god damn it. I'm gonna hit stop. Ready? Here we go. Bye-bye.
Safe word.
On the morning of July 31st, 2000.